A Chinese ambassador calls for cooperation with the U.S., while a U.S. spokesperson challenges Beijing to follow through, outlining 3 steps for the regime to take. Chinese authorities have begun celebrating the so-called victory against the epidemic, but residents inside Wuhan tell a different story. A rush to produce face masks in China. Where are they being made, and how is the quality of these masks? Video conferencing software Zoom is facing a lawsuit for misleading shareholders on its privacy and encryption standards. President Trump questions whether the U.S. should continue funding the World Health Organization after the way it handled the virus pandemic. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. The Chinese ambassador to the U.S. is calling for the U.S. and China to work together instead of blaming each other. This after the regime blaming the U.S. for bringing the virus to China, a claim they have since retracted. On April 7th, the U.S. State Department told Beijing to put its words into action. And 1. Share virus data. 2. Let international teams investigate how the outbreak began in China. And 3. Allow Chinese citizens freedom of speech. She added, true cooperation requires transparency and real actions, not just rhetoric. And Wuhan lifted the lockdown on April 8th. Radio Free Asia is reporting that authorities are trying to create the illusion of victory against the epidemic by kicking virus patients out of hospitals before they have recovered. It tells the story of a 69-year-old resident who was discharged from a hospital after doctors said he tested negative and had healed. But his daughter says he still had a lung infection and fever. Doctors still had to keep his trachea open for treatment and provide other critical care. Recovered patients usually go to a hotel to self-quarantine for 14 days. But this man was so sick he was transferred to another smaller health center. This center did not have the resources to care for the man and soon declared he would die soon. But the first hospital still refused to admit him again. After his daughter went public about the issue online, the hospital decided to admit him again. His wife told Radio Free Asia that she is upset Wuhan did not warn the public about human-to-human transmission in time. A number of media in China have begun celebrating the so-called victory against the epidemic. They show beautiful river beaches, reopened restaurants, and people filling the streets. But any online comments about the death toll or who should be held accountable in Wuhan are still being promptly deleted. We previously reported that authorities in Guangdong province said new cases there were related to the African community. A source in China has sent us video showing an African person being forced to take the CCP virus test.
Is it just a test, nothing more involved, right?
Just a test.
Just a test?
Yes.
Okay.
The title of the video is, Why Are Only Africans Being Forced to Take COVID-19 Tests in China? For weeks, Chinese authorities reported 0 or single-digit confirmed cases in China. They said most of the confirmed cases were imported from overseas. According to our research, cases emerged in many cities in China but were being covered up. Experts predict that when the second outbreak comes in China, the CCP will shift the blame to cases imported from other countries. Some people in Wuhan are so excited to get out of lockdown, they have been lining up since before midnight. NTD's Juliet Song reports.
Tens of thousands of people are rushing to leave Wuhan after authorities lifted a 2-month lockdown. A video posted on social media shows cars blaring horns together as they leave highway toll stations. Miss Liu is one of those who have left. She lined up at the checkpoints around midnight. Stuck in Wuhan for almost 80 days, she is ready to go home. We've given her a pseudonym and distorted her voice to protect her identity.
Right now, the policy is unpredictable. Since the policy has changed, leave now while you still can. The policy is changing constantly. I wouldn't be able to bear it if they put the city under lockdown again.
Liu said she saw hundreds of cars coming behind her when she left. At least 65,000 people were expected to leave the city on Wednesday, based on data from the Railway and Aviation Administrations. Ms. Liu was over 300 miles away from Wuhan when she spoke to us on the road.
I feel okay, pretty good. Finally, I can go back home. I can live in a spacious place. I'm happy even if I have to self-quarantine at home. At least I can go back to my own home.
Mr. Chen lives in Wuhan and used to work in a neighboring province. He also left after the restriction was lifted.
Leave as soon as possible. Who knows if there will be other restrictions tomorrow.
Residents in other regions are not so happy about the end of lockdown, fearing virus carriers will come from Wuhan.
People in Shanghai are really worried, I tell you. Several WeChat groups I'm in are all talking about this. They're all concerned about asymptomatic carriers from Wuhan.
Wuhan's Tianhe airport has resumed its operations, but authorities say flights between Hubei and Beijing are still suspended due to, quote, necessary virus outbreak prevention and control efforts. Reporting by Xiahua Gu and Juliet Song, NTD News.
But many Wuhan residents are still afraid as asymptomatic cases keep rising. NTD Xiwen Rong has the story.
While Chinese state media shows a celebration of Wuhan's borders reopening after 2 months of lockdown, some areas are still restricted. A netizen posted a video saying on April 8th, the Hanhua community in Wuhan was sealed shut again and people were not allowed to leave. There are new suspected cases of infection. On the same day, videos circulated showing an unconscious person lying on the ground on a street in Wuhan. Police and people in full protective suits look on. Official reports show that some communities in Wuhan have asymptomatic carriers, but the Chinese regime isn't counting them as confirmed cases. On April 6th, state-run media Xinhua quoted the Hubei provincial government, saying that in Wuhan, 70 residential areas lost their virus-free designation after authorities detected asymptomatic carriers living there. A Wuhan resident told us lifting quarantine doesn't change people's freedom much. It mostly affects citizens working outside Wuhan. For a resident to leave their homes to work, they need a special certificate from their company to let them leave and return into the residential area. Another certificate is needed to go buy groceries, and they can only stay out for a maximum of 2 hours. They say these restrictions will last till the end of April. As more and more asymptomatic carriers are detected, some China analysts worry that a larger outbreak may be unavoidable, especially since the epicenter has opened its borders and Wuhan authorities are encouraging people to go back to work. Reporting by Xiwen Rong, NTD News.
There's a rush to make face masks in China, but where are they being made and what's the quality like?
The world is scrambling for medical supplies, including face masks. As the world's factory, Chinese factories are flooded with orders. But while demand is high, residents say the quality is low.
I don't dare to use these masks made nowadays. From what I know, many small businesses now started making face masks. They just got some equipment in small factories and can now produce 50 to 60,000 per day.
According to a business data company in China, nearly 5,500 new companies registered to produce face masks between late January and mid-March. But one mask exporter says many manufacturers just switched from making clothing or electronics and they lack certification. He estimates that 60% don't have sterile environments. One factory he went to was full of dust and workers weren't wearing masks or gloves. Mr. Chiang told us it's the same where he works.
It's impossible for the production environment to be clean and sterile.
Since the end of March, Chinese customs seized over 11 million pieces of faulty medical supplies. The majority were face masks. According to AFP, almost 4 billion masks have been exported since March 1st. But the quality is questionable. The Netherlands recalled 600,000 masks imported from China. Some didn't protect the face and some had bad filters. Millions of masks sent to Austria at the end of March were also faulty. Until recently, the U.S. did not accept Chinese-made high-protection KN95 masks. But given the domestic shortages, they can now be imported.
The Chinese Communist Party said it is investigating the outspoken Chinese property tycoon. Ren Ziqiang had been missing since March after criticizing Communist leader Xi Jinping and the party for mishandling the virus outbreak.
This is the first message from Chinese officials since Ren Ziqiang went missing in mid-March. The outspoken Chinese millionaire was charged with seriously violating the law and Communist Party regulations, but the specifics of the allegation are not clear. The investigation comes after Ren wrote an article in February criticizing the Communist Party for allowing the virus to spread and then censoring the public. He compared the CCP's leader to a power-hungry clown and wrote that the root cause of the problem is a ruling party that is not supervised by the people and goes unchecked by the law. The system serves only the leader's power and his core interest. The article circulated on Chinese social media sites. Ren is a longtime Communist Party member, a retired chairman of a state-owned property company, and the son of a high-ranking communist official. He is also known online for his outspoken criticism of the authorities. His nickname is Big Cannon Ren. Critics say Ren's case reflects growing discontent within the Communist Party itself and in China as a whole. Penny Zhou, NTD News.
President Trump considering cutting off funding to the World Health Organization. He criticizes it for not warning the world about the crisis as soon as it should have. The organization's director has responded.
President Trump announced Tuesday an investigation into the World Health Organization, WHO, for its part in delaying the international community's response to the pandemic. He is considering putting a hold on funding while the investigation takes place.
They missed the call. They could have called it months earlier. They would have known. And they should have known. And they probably did know. So we'll be looking into that very carefully.
The director of the WHO, who was a member of the terrorist group Tigray People's Liberation Front in Ethiopia, responded to the president, telling him not to politicize the virus.
And if you want to have many more body bags, then you do it. If you don't want many more body bags, then you refrain from politicizing it.
Journalist Alex Newman at Liberty Sentinel Media, who has written op-eds for the Epoch Times, agrees with the president's decision and says the WHO director's response has a dangerous attitude.
It almost strikes me as a threat. You don't give us what we want and more people will die. That's kind of, like terrorist-style negotiations. I, for one, don't think the World Health Organization has contributed at all to the saving of lives. In fact, I think it's done quite the opposite.
Newman says Dr. Tedros' attacks on President Trump for shutting down flights from China could have cost lives. He also believes the WHO has been acting as a mouthpiece for the Chinese regime.
And in the UK, anger is growing over the Chinese regime and its attempts to cover up the new virus. Politicians warning that disinformation is costing lives. Our UK correspondent Jane Werrell has more.
The Chinese Communist Party failed to disclose vital information about the initial coronavirus outbreak and has breached international law, according to findings in a new report that says the Chinese regime should be sued.
We have to continue to apply pressure on the Chinese authorities to share all and every bit of information that they possess for the greater good of humanity. And if they show any unwillingness to do that, we need to make certain that they're held accountable.
The report, published by the UK foreign policy think tank Henry Jackson Society, says China could be liable to compensate the world's top 7 economies at least $4 trillion.
If you allow a rogue state like this get close to you, whether you are Iran or Britain, you're in trouble. Now we're in trouble because we have far too much in our setup already, which gives the Chinese pressure points that they can apply to us.
Several lawsuits have already been launched in the US, suing the regime for the economic damage the pandemic has caused to Americans. Some British lawmakers are criticising the CCP's initial cover-up of the pandemic. Politicians from the UK's Foreign Affairs Committee said that disinformation from China is costing lives. British politician Ian Duncan Smith, former leader of the UK Conservative Party, says Chinese disinformation is happening on an enormous scale, and the behaviour can no longer continue.
They seem now to be putting out misinformation all over the place about where this started, even trying to blame the United States. Some blamed Italy and said it's had an outbreak in September and didn't tell anybody. Many other countries have had enough of this behaviour by China, and it doesn't look like it's going to stop.
Unreliable figures and information from China means that the true scale of the tragedy within China remains unknown, as the virus continues to take lives and infect people both inside and outside of China. People here are wanting answers. Jane Werrell, NTD News, London.
Earlier, the UK Finance Minister confirmed the largest daily rise in UK death at 938, bringing the total number of deaths to 7,097. The Chinese Communist Party is trying to change the narrative surrounding the CCP virus pandemic and use it to foster geopolitical goals. But some politicians in Europe see through its efforts. NTD's Germany correspondent Christian Watchen has the story.
After almost 11 weeks on lockdown, authorities in Wuhan are lifting all travel restrictions. For the past several weeks, the CCP has reported 0 or near 0 new infections in the whole of China. But not everyone is convinced the epidemic is truly over.
That the Chinese had supposedly already fought the epidemic. I think this is a fairy tale of the central government in Beijing, which in turn shows what a communist dictatorship does in terms of propaganda to the outside world.
Criticism is growing over the CCP's failing to contain the virus. Some politicians in Europe point out how Chinese authorities knew about it early on, and how they destroyed virus samples, detained citizen journalists, and silenced doctors who tried to sound the alarm.
Already in November, the first reports within China were forwarded to Beijing and to the health authorities that there is a new lung disease. And typical for a system like China's, which is not democratic and pluralistically set up, they therefore first tried to cover it up.
Found that if the Chinese regime had acted just 3 weeks earlier, 95% of infections could have been prevented.
If we had had 6 weeks lead time, if the WHO had already issued a warning at the end of November, we would probably not have many thousands of deaths on our books. China must be held accountable.
In March, the pandemic started battering Europe. China began sending medical teams and protective gear, though many were regular exports, to affected countries like Italy. The regime used those efforts as part of a propaganda campaign to restore its image.
I find it really bizarre when you know how things have gone in China, how many people have really had to sacrifice their existence, even their lives, to get the Chinese central government to admit that there are problems. And today, people are pretending that China is the great savior of the world. The opposite is unfortunately the case.
The regime has been targeting European countries for years. For example, as part of the Belt and Road Infrastructure Project, critics are concerned China aims to create dependency and divide Europe.
They help you with fast money, with initiatives. But in the end, you end up under the heel of Beijing. You have to see it for what it is. China tries to assert its interests in the world through its economy and to raise to the next hegemonic power.
As countries in Europe continue to struggle with the pandemic and its fallout, some observers see it as a chance to gain more clarity on the CCP's true nature and its intentions. Reporting by Christian Watchen, NTD News, Berlin.
A shareholder now is suing video conferencing software Zoom for hiding the fact that its software isn't end-to-end encrypted. It comes after it was discovered the company is storing sensitive information on servers in China.
Video conferencing software Zoom is facing a lawsuit for misleading shareholders on its privacy and encryption standards. This after it was discovered Zoom was storing private encryption keys on servers in China. What experts say is a major security risk. Zoom is an American company, but its founder is from China. It's now being sued by one of its shareholders after recent media reports on the privacy flaws caused the company's stock to plummet. Zoom was growing fast during the lockdown, jumping from 10 million daily users to 200 million. Businesses and even high-level officials using the service to stay connected. But many governments and businesses have now banned the use of the platform, including Elon Musk's company, SpaceX.
And in New York, record deaths 2 days in a row. But it looks like the virus's plateau is on the horizon, if not there already. NTD's Miguel Moreno has more.
Another day of record deaths in New York. Nearly 800 on Tuesday, all patients infected with the disease caused by the CCP virus.
The bad news isn't just bad. The bad news is actually terrible. Highest single-day death toll yet, 779 people.
Cuomo said the number may continue to rise as patients hospitalized for longer periods pass away. But there's good news. With the hospitalization rate down more and more, it's looking like New York has reached the plateau.
We took dramatic actions in this state. New York Pause program that closed down schools, businesses, social distancing, and it's working. It is flattening the curve.
Mayor Bill de Blasio also reminded New Yorkers not to jump the gun and asked them to double down on preventative measures.
We know from some other parts of the world that they started to see a little bit of progress, took their foot off the gas, let down their guard, and guess what? This awful, ferocious disease started to reassert itself.
And the progress has been dramatic. On ventilators alone, the city said last week it would need 200 to 300 more per day. Now de Blasio says it looks like they have enough to get through this week. Miguel Moreno, NTD News, New York.
Automaker General Motors is getting a $500 million contract to make ventilators for CCP virus patients. It's the first such contract issued under the Defense Production Act. President Trump invoked the act to get companies to produce essential supplies. GM plans to deliver 30,000 ventilators by the end of August, the first few thousand by June 1st. The company says it can supply more if needed. It's spending hundreds of millions to retool its factories and suppliers. Its rival, Ford, is also planning to produce tens of thousands of ventilators over the next 100 days. In Europe, the number of daily deaths in Spain is on the rise again. And in Italy, ports are tightening their restrictions for incoming migrant ships.
The number of daily coronavirus deaths rose in Spain as 757 people died over the past 24 hours. The total fatalities in the country is now over 14,000. Patients are sometimes transported to areas with more hospital capacity. To prepare, Spanish paramedics simulated transporting virus patients on a high-speed train. The trains have a capacity of 24 patients and can travel across the country. Charity ships which rescue migrants on the coast of Libya are no longer allowed to dock at Italian ports. This is because the ports aren't considered safe during the epidemic. The new measure has support from across the political spectrum, with staunch migration advocates also signing on. What might look like medieval Europe is actually Vienna under lockdown. Horse-drawn carriages delivering meals. The carriage owners usually survive off tourists, but since hotel stays are banned right now, business is slow. So some drivers are using their free time to deliver the 200 to 300 free meals prepared by a local hotel. The meals mostly go to the elderly and most vulnerable.
The U.S. oil market is suffering under the pandemic. Crude oil stockpiles are way up while demand is down as producers try to adjust oil production.
U.S. crude oil stockpiles soared while fuel demand slumped last week, each by their most in a single week ever. The oil industry is feeling the brunt of efforts to stem the spread of the CCP virus. Oil markets crashed as the pandemic sapped fuel demand. Commercial aviation is virtually shut down worldwide. Gasoline demand plummeted as people stay at home and businesses remain shuttered. U.S. fuel demand has dropped by about 1/3 within the last 3 weeks, marking last week's record-breaking fall of 3.4 million barrels per day. The demand decline for gasoline has been especially sharp, which has been cut nearly in half in the last 3 weeks alone. The weekly figures on refining activity and oil production show the industry making painful adjustments to throttle back activities. Worldwide demand is expected to drop by roughly 30%. U.S. refiners are now operating at just over 75% capacity, the lowest rate since September 2008. Production was cut by 600,000 barrels per day.
Self-isolation can be a tough adjustment. Whether you are trying to support loved ones who are alone or you are made to isolate yourself, here are some simple approaches to help ease the emotional burden.
Avoiding contact with others for prolonged time is a new situation we're facing in society, and it hasn't been an easy adjustment.
It's a really big change. It's so different than what I'm used to.
Social distancing for me has been really hard because I miss my friends from school and I want to see them again.
Clinical psychologist Dr. Gardere explains it may evoke feelings of anxiety, depression, or other unpleasant emotions.
Those of us who are at home and have to stay at home, it's easy to lose a sense of self because we're completely thrown off of our routines.
Being gone from school this long throws me off, and I don't know what day it is sometimes.
That, coupled with fear and uncertainty about the future, can be difficult to cope with. But Dr. Gardere says keeping up a routine is key.
Where they don't lounge around in pajamas and actually wear casual clothing so that they have some purpose in their lives. And of course, exercise, regular meals.
He says it's a good idea to do similar things at home that you'd normally do at work or school.
And do school from 8:30 to 3:40, just like I normally would physically going to school, just now it's in a different form.
And another tip from psychologists, keep spirits high by staying in touch with loved ones, helping to make the isolation a little less isolating. Melina Weiskup, NTD News, New York.
And health officials in Iran say China's virus data misled global organizations and caused them to underestimate its potential impact. Iran's health ministry spokesman, who is also a doctor, said initially China made it seem like the virus was no different than the flu.
Iranian health officials have doubts over China's reported number of deaths from the CCP virus. AFP reported that pioneer AIDS specialists and head of the Iranian Center for HIV and AIDS said China's numbers are not trustworthy. She also said the Chinese regime is retracting many of their articles and that the studies and figures once published were not accurate. Another Iranian task force official, Hamid Suri, said China's figures were far from the truth. The epidemiologist saying he based his judgment on the worldwide spread and high fatalities worldwide. Suri on Monday estimated there were 500,000 cases of the virus in Iran, many more than some 60,000 of Iran's official figures. He says many cases are undetected. Iran's health ministry spokesman, who is also a doctor, came under fire in recent days for questioning China's transparency. He said China made it seem as if the virus was like the flu, but less deadly. Another media outlet, The New Arab, reported he had called China's virus data a bitter joke. He said the information given by China led 11 academic centers in the world to initially underestimate the threat from the virus.